In 2010, a group of brilliant college students at one of America's most elite schools began to vanish. Not physically, but psychologically. Their families watched in horror as their children transformed into strangers, cut off all contact, and disappeared into what prosecutors would later call a decade-long nightmare of systematic torture and exploitation. The perpetrator wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was living openly, documenting his crimes obsessively, convinced he was too intelligent to ever face justice. But what he didn't anticipate was that his own arrogance would become the evidence that destroyed him. This is the story of how investigators unraveled one of the most disturbing cases of psychological manipulation in modern American history, and how a monster who thought he created the perfect crime ended up convicted on every single count, sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Larry Ray wasn't a stranger to criminal activity when he arrived at Sarah Lawrence College. Born Lawrence Greco, he had a history that should have raised immediate red flags. He'd served time in federal prison for securities fraud. He'd been involved in various schemes throughout his life. But perhaps most telling was his documented pattern of manipulating those closest to him. When he was released from prison in 2010, he claimed he had nowhere to go. His daughter, Talia Ray, was a freshman at Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York, and she agreed to let him temporarily stay in her on-campus apartment. It was a decision that would change the lives of everyone in that living space forever. Sarah Lawrence College prides itself on intellectual rigor and independent thinking. Students are encouraged to question authority and think critically. The young people living in that campus apartment were exactly the kind of bright, ambitious individuals the school attracted. They came from successful families. They had their whole lives ahead of them. They were studying literature, politics, art, and philosophy. These weren't vulnerable runaways or individuals society had forgotten. They were society's success stories in the making, which made what happened next all the more chilling and all the more difficult for investigators to later understand. Larry Ray began his manipulation almost immediately, but his methods were subtle at first. He positioned himself as a father figure, a mentor, someone who had lived a fascinating life and had wisdom to share. He told elaborate stories about his past, claiming connections to intelligence agencies and law enforcement. He said he'd worked as an informant for the FBI. He described himself as a victim of government conspiracies. He spoke with confidence and authority about psychology, politics, and human nature. To young college students still forming their worldviews, he seemed worldly and intriguing. What they didn't know was that they were being systematically evaluated, their vulnerabilities cataloged, their weak points identified. The investigative timeline that would eventually emerge showed Ray's tactics evolve slowly and deliberately. He began hosting what he called therapy sessions in the apartment. Students would gather, and Ray would lead discussions about their families, their relationships, their deepest insecurities. He presented himself as someone who could help them understand themselves better. He identified problems in their lives, conflicts with parents, romantic disappointments, personal doubts. Then he offered himself as the solution. If you're enjoying this deep dive into how investigators unraveled this complex case, please hit that like button. It helps us bring you more detailed true crime investigations like this one. What made Ray's manipulation particularly insidious, and what would later prove challenging for investigators to document, was how he turned victims against each other and even against themselves. He employed a tactic psychologists call attack therapy, a brutal form of psychological confrontation. Ray would accuse his victims of having wronged him in some way. He'd claim they'd stolen from him, damaged his property, or betrayed his trust. These accusations were false, but Ray was relentless. He would berate victims for hours, sometimes days, demanding confessions. Sleep-deprived, emotionally exhausted, and desperate to make the psychological torture stop, victims would eventually confess to things they never did. Ray would record these confessions on video. Then he would use those recorded confessions as leverage, as proof of their guilt, as justification for what came next. The case files that investigators would later review contained hundreds of hours of these recordings. Federal prosecutors would describe them as some of the most disturbing evidence they'd encountered. In the videos, young people who'd entered college with bright futures could be seen broken down, confessing through tears to crimes they didn't commit, begging for forgiveness, accepting blame for elaborate scenarios Ray had fabricated. The psychological devastation was visible and measurable. But in 2010, 2011, and 2012, no one was investigating. No law enforcement agency was aware of what was happening. The abuse was occurring in plain sight, yet remained invisible. By 2011, Ray had effectively taken control of multiple victims' lives. Some had moved out of the dorm and into an apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan that Ray controlled. Others remained at Sarah Lawrence but were under his psychological domination. Ray had convinced them they owed him money, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, for the damages he claimed they'd caused him. To pay off these fabricated debts, Ray forced his victims to work. Some held down multiple jobs, turning over their paychecks entirely to Ray. Others were sent to perform manual labor. The financial exploitation was extensive and methodical. But the abuse went far beyond financial control. Ray subjected victims to physical and sexual abuse. He forced at least one victim, a young woman named Claudia Drury, into prostitution to pay off the debt he claimed she owed him. Between 2013 and 2020, prosecutors would later prove Ray forced Drury to engage in commercial sex work, directing her activities and collecting the money. The amounts were staggering. Evidence showed Ray extracted more than $500,000 from Drury alone through forced prostitution. He kept detailed records, photographs, and financial documentation, apparently confident he would never be held accountable. The question that would haunt investigators was simple: how did no one notice? The answer was complex. Ray was a master of isolation. He turned victims against their families, convincing them their parents were toxic, manipulative, or trying to control them. When concerned family members reached out, victims defended Ray. He controlled their communication, monitored their interactions, and punished any perceived disloyalty. He also exploited the independence that college students naturally seek. When Talia Ray's roommates stopped coming home for holidays or became distant from their families, it seemed like typical college rebellion. When they dropped out of school or changed their behavior, it looked like personal choices, not coercion. Sarah Lawrence College itself would face difficult questions about what it knew and when. Ray lived in campus housing for an extended period. Students under his control exhibited concerning behavior. But the decentralized nature of the college, its emphasis on student independence, and the private nature of what was occurring made intervention difficult. By the time the college became aware of the full scope of the situation, Ray had moved off campus, and the victims were adults, making what appeared to be their own choices, however destructive those choices were. The break in the case came not from law enforcement but from journalism. In 2019, New York Magazine published a detailed investigation titled "The Stolen Kids of Sarah Lawrence." Reporter Ezra Marcus had been tipped off about the situation and spent months investigating. The article laid out in shocking detail what Ray had done. It included testimonies from some victims, documentation of the abuse, and evidence of Ray's criminal enterprise. The article went viral, bringing national attention to a case that had been hidden for nearly a decade. Subscribe to our channel if you want to stay updated on cases where justice eventually catches up with predators, no matter how long it takes. The New York Magazine article did something crucial. It gave law enforcement a roadmap. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the FBI began investigating immediately. What they found was overwhelming evidence of Ray's crimes, much of it created by Ray himself. He had compulsively documented his abuse. There were thousands of text messages showing his manipulation and control. There were videos of the psychological torture sessions. There were financial records showing the money he'd extracted from victims. There were emails, photographs, and recordings. Ray had apparently believed his manipulation was so complete, his control so total, that his victims would never turn against him and authorities would never believe them if they did. Investigators conducted extensive interviews with victims, a process that was both crucial and challenging. Many victims were still under Ray's psychological control to some degree. They struggled to recognize themselves as victims. They'd spent years being told they were perpetrators, that they owed Ray, that they deserved the abuse. Deprogramming that psychological conditioning took time, patience, and expertise. The FBI brought in specialists in coercive control and psychological manipulation. Prosecutors worked to help victims understand that the confessions Ray had extracted were false, that the debts he claimed they owed were fabricated, that what had happened to them was criminal abuse, not their fault. The financial investigation revealed the full scope of Ray's exploitation. Forensic accountants traced money flows, bank accounts, and cash transactions. The evidence showed Ray had extracted approximately $1 million from his victims over the years. He'd lived lavishly off their forced labor and exploitation while they suffered. He'd taken elaborate vacations, dined at expensive restaurants, and maintained a lifestyle funded entirely by the people he was abusing. Every dollar could be traced back to a victim, to forced work, to commercial sex trafficking, to psychological coercion. In February 2020, federal agents arrested Larry Ray at his residence in Piscataway, New Jersey. The arrest brought relief to victims and their families who had watched helplessly as their loved ones disappeared into Ray's control. Ray was charged with an array of federal crimes: sex trafficking, extortion, forced labor, and racketeering conspiracy. The indictment laid out a decade-long criminal enterprise built on psychological manipulation and exploitation. If Ray had thought his victims wouldn't speak up or wouldn't be believed, he was wrong. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and prosecutors were determined to hold him accountable for every crime he'd committed. The federal case against Larry Ray was assigned to prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, known for handling complex white-collar and organized crime cases. But this case was different from typical prosecutions. The challenge wasn't proving that crimes had occurred. The evidence of that was clear. The challenge was helping a jury understand the psychological mechanisms that had allowed Ray to maintain control over educated, intelligent adults for so many years. How do you explain coercive control to people who've never experienced it? How do you make comprehensible the reality that smart, capable people can be systematically broken down and controlled? Prosecutors built their case methodically. They organized the evidence chronologically, showing how Ray's control escalated over time. They brought in expert witnesses to explain coercive control, psychological manipulation, and trauma bonding. They prepared victims to testify, knowing that defense attorneys would challenge their credibility and try to suggest they participated willingly. The prosecution strategy was to let Ray's own words and actions prove his guilt. The videos he'd recorded, the messages he'd sent, the confessions he'd coerced, all of it demonstrated a pattern of deliberate, calculated abuse. Ray's defense team faced an uphill battle. The evidence was extensive and damning. Their strategy focused on trying to undermine the credibility of victims, suggesting they'd exaggerated or fabricated the abuse. They portrayed Ray as a flawed person who'd had complicated relationships with adults who made their own choices. But that narrative fell apart against the mountain of evidence, showing coercion, force, and exploitation. You couldn't watch the videos of Ray berating a sobbing victim for hours and conclude it was a consensual relationship. You couldn't look at the financial records showing forced prostitution and call it a business partnership. The trial began in March 2022 in federal court in Manhattan. Over the course of several weeks, jurors heard testimony from victims who bravely recounted the years of abuse they'd endured. Claudia Drury, the victim Ray had forced into prostitution, testified about the physical and sexual abuse, the forced commercial sex work, and the complete control Ray had exercised over her life. She described being poisoned by Ray, being subjected to hours-long interrogations, being forced to perform sex acts while Ray watched and directed. Her testimony was powerful and heartbreaking, and it was corroborated by extensive documentary evidence. Other victims testified about the psychological torture, the false confessions, the forced labor, and the destruction of their relationships with their families. They described how Ray had identified their vulnerabilities and exploited them, how he'd isolated them from anyone who might help, how he'd convinced them they were terrible people who deserved punishment. They explained how he'd used therapy language and psychological concepts to make his abuse seem like healing, how he'd positioned himself as the only person who truly understood them, how he'd made them dependent on his approval and terrified of his anger. The jury also heard from family members who'd watched helplessly as their children disappeared into Ray's control. Parents described desperate attempts to reach their sons and daughters only to be shut out or told they were the problem. They recounted hiring private investigators, consulting lawyers, and seeking help from anyone who might be able to intervene. They described the agony of knowing something was terribly wrong but being unable to stop it. Their testimony humanized the victims and showed the ripple effects of Ray's crimes beyond just the people he directly abused. Prosecutors presented the financial evidence, walking the jury through bank records, Venmo transactions, and cash payments that showed the flow of money from victims to Ray. They showed that Ray had no legitimate source of income during the years he was living lavishly. Every dollar came from exploitation. The money trail was clear, detailed, and impossible to explain away. It was the work of years of abuse transformed into dollars and cents, quantifiable and provable beyond any doubt. Perhaps most damning was Ray's own voice. Prosecutors played hours of recordings Ray had made, letting the jury hear his tactics firsthand. They heard him berating victims, making impossible demands, extracting false confessions, and reveling in his control. Ray's own words convicted him more powerfully than any testimony could. The jury could hear the manipulation, the cruelty, the calculated nature of the abuse. There was no way to paint it as anything other than what it was: systematic criminal exploitation. The defense called few witnesses. Ray himself did not testify, likely on the advice of his attorneys, who knew he would be eviscerated on cross-examination. The defense tried to create doubt about the victim's credibility, but it was futile. The evidence was too strong, too consistent, too well documented. When closing arguments concluded, it took the jury less than a day to reach a verdict. In April 2022, Larry Ray was found guilty on all 15 counts against him, including sex trafficking, extortion, forced labor, racketeering, conspiracy, and other charges. The verdict brought tears of relief from victims and their families who had waited years for this moment. The guilty verdict was just the beginning of accountability. Sentencing was scheduled for several months later, giving victims an opportunity to prepare impact statements and prosecutors time to argue for an appropriate sentence. Given the severity of the crimes, the number of victims, and the decade-long duration of Ray's criminal enterprise, prosecutors indicated they would seek a lengthy prison sentence. Ray faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. For the victims, the verdict meant validation. What they'd experienced was real, it was criminal, and it was Ray's fault, not theirs. In January 2023, Larry Ray appeared in federal court for sentencing. Judge Lewis Lyman, who had presided over the trial, heard impact statements from victims who described the lasting damage Ray's abuse had inflicted on their lives. They talked about interrupted educations, destroyed careers, damaged relationships with families, and ongoing psychological trauma. They described nightmares, trust issues, and the long process of rebuilding their sense of self after years of being told they were worthless. Their statements were powerful testimonies to the long-term impact of psychological abuse and coercive control. Prosecutors argued that Ray deserved the maximum possible sentence. They emphasized the calculated nature of his crimes, the vulnerability of his victims, the duration of the abuse, and Ray's complete lack of remorse. They pointed out that even during the trial, Ray had shown no empathy for his victims and no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. He remained manipulative and self-serving to the end, exactly the person the evidence had shown him to be. Judge Lehman sentenced Larry Ray to 60 years in federal prison. The sentence was effectively a life term for the 62-year-old defendant. In imposing the sentence, Judge Lehman described Ray's crimes as sadistic and noted that he had shown no remorse for the harm he'd caused. The judge emphasized that Ray had targeted vulnerable young people and had destroyed their lives for his own gratification and financial gain. The 60-year sentence ensured that Ray would never again have the opportunity to manipulate and exploit others. It was justice delivered, long overdue but finally realized. The case had broader implications beyond just Ray's conviction. It brought attention to the phenomenon of coercive control and psychological abuse, particularly in situations where victims are isolated and manipulated over extended periods. Law enforcement agencies began training officers to recognize signs of this type of abuse, which doesn't always leave physical evidence, but can be just as destructive as physical violence. Prosecutors developed better strategies for presenting these cases to juries, helping ordinary people understand how intelligent, capable individuals can become trapped in abusive situations. Sarah Lawrence College faced difficult questions about its policies and oversight. How had Ray been able to live in campus housing without proper authorization? Why hadn't warning signs been acted upon more quickly? What support had been available for students showing signs of distress? The college conducted internal reviews and implemented new policies designed to prevent similar situations. While the college maintained it had acted appropriately based on the information available at the time, the case prompted important conversations about institutional responsibility for student safety. For the victims, the conclusion of the trial and Ray's sentencing marked an important milestone in their healing process, but it wasn't the end of their journey. Many continued therapy to address the trauma they'd experienced. Some had resumed their educations, completing degrees that had been interrupted by years under Ray's control. Others were rebuilding relationships with families that had been fractured by Ray's manipulation. The path forward was challenging, but with Ray behind bars and unable to hurt them anymore, healing became possible. The case also sparked important conversations about how society recognizes and responds to abuse that doesn't fit traditional patterns. Ray's victims weren't children, weren't obviously vulnerable, and weren't prevented from leaving by physical restraints. This made their situation harder for outsiders to understand and harder for them to escape. The case demonstrated that coercive control can be as powerful as locked doors, that psychological manipulation can be as destructive as physical violence, and that victims of this type of abuse deserve the same recognition, support, and justice as victims of more conventional crimes. Journalists who had covered the case continued to follow the victims' stories, documenting their recovery and the long-term impact of Ray's abuse. The original New York Magazine article that had brought the case to light was expanded and updated, providing a comprehensive look at the entire saga from beginning to end. The case was featured in documentaries and true crime programs, but those involved tried to ensure that the focus remained on the investigation, the evidence, and the justice that was ultimately served rather than sensationalizing the abuse itself. If this detailed breakdown of the investigative process has kept you engaged, consider sharing this video and leaving a comment about what aspect of the investigation impressed you most. Was it the forensic accounting that traced every dollar? The way prosecutors helped victims understand they weren't to blame? The power of journalism in bringing the case to light? Your engagement helps us continue covering cases where meticulous police work brings predators to justice. The Larry Ray case stands as a stark reminder that predators come in many forms and that manipulation can be as dangerous as physical force. Ray didn't need weapons or locked rooms to control his victims. He used psychology, isolation, and systematic abuse to create a prison his victims carried with them wherever they went. But the case also demonstrates the power of thorough investigation and persistent prosecution. Every piece of evidence mattered. Every victim who found the courage to speak up contributed to building the case that ultimately put Ray away for life. Federal agents and prosecutors who worked the case have described it as one of the most challenging and emotionally difficult investigations of their careers. Reviewing hundreds of hours of abuse recordings took a psychological toll on investigators. Building trust with victims who had been systematically taught not to trust anyone required patience and expertise. Organizing a decade's worth of evidence into a coherent narrative demanded exceptional skill, but they persisted because the crimes demanded justice, and the victims deserved to be heard and believed. The investigation succeeded because multiple elements came together. Brave journalism brought the case to light. Victims found the courage to cooperate with investigators despite their fear and psychological conditioning. Law enforcement brought expertise in financial crimes, sex trafficking, and psychological abuse. Prosecutors built a case that was both comprehensive and comprehensible. Expert witnesses helped the jury understand the mechanisms of coercive control, and ultimately, 12 jurors recognized the truth of what had happened and held Ray accountable for every crime he committed. The case file on Larry Ray is now closed. He is serving 60 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. His victims are free, rebuilding their lives, and finding ways to move forward. The investigation that brought him to justice stands as an example of how patient, thorough police work can unravel even the most complex criminal enterprises. It shows that predators who believe they're too smart to be caught, who think they've covered their tracks perfectly, who assume their victims will never speak up, are wrong. Justice may be delayed, but it arrives eventually, backed by evidence, powered by truth, and delivered by investigators who refuse to give up. As we close this deep dive into one of the most disturbing criminal cases of the past decade, it's important to remember the victims whose lives were interrupted and damaged by Larry Ray's systematic abuse. Many of them were barely adults when they fell under his control. They should have been studying, building careers, and enjoying their youth. Instead, they endured years of psychological torture, exploitation, and abuse. But they survived, they found the strength to speak up, and they saw their abuser held accountable. Their courage in testifying and cooperating with investigators ensured that Ray will spend the rest of his life in prison, unable to hurt anyone else. If this investigation resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more detailed breakdowns of how law enforcement solves complex criminal cases. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how investigators pieced this case together and what you think was the key evidence that sealed Ray's fate. The story of the Sarah Lawrence sex cult is a dark chapter in the lives of everyone involved, but it's also a story of resilience, justice, and the power of truth. The victims' lives were stolen for nearly a decade, but they got them back. Larry Ray thought he was untouchable, but he was wrong. And that's the lesson that echoes beyond this particular case. No matter how clever predators think they are, no matter how completely they believe they've controlled their victims, justice has a way of finding them in the end. Evidence doesn't forget, victims' voices matter, and investigators don't give up. That's how cases like this get solved, and that's how predators like Larry Ray end up exactly where they belong, behind bars for life.